Welcome to this webinar on helping kids see God in science. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I run Foundation Worldview, which is a ministry that's designed to equip Christian parents, educators, and church leaders with easy to implement resources to get the kids in their care thinking critically and biblically and understanding that Christianity is true. And now, in this role that I play at Foundation Worldview, I'm always seeking to learn more because I am not a scholar. I am simply a translator. And so here at Foundation Worldview, what we do is we translate complex philosophical and theological and scientific ideas into language and activities and examples that children as young as 4 can understand. So it often takes me a long time to be able to understand those lofty ideas. But once I can understand them, then the way the Lord has gifted me is as a translator. And so last summer, in an effort to continue learning and growing, I had the privilege of taking part in a summer seminar that was led by the Discovery Institute out in Seattle. And when I was there, it was a week-long seminar, and it was about 10, maybe even 12 hours of classes every day. It was quite overwhelming, but there were so many amazing things that I just learned about seeing design in nature. And I remember on the first day of the seminar, Dr. John West, who was leading it, he said, one thing that is consistent every year is that Dr. Brian Miller always gets the highest ratings as for anybody who gives a lecture here. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. And then several days later, Dr. Miller gave a few different talks. And I thought, and now I understand why he gets the highest ratings of any professor, because he just made his areas of expertise so understandable to someone like me who does not have a science background. And so after that, that night at dinner, I went up to Dr. Miller and I asked him if he would be willing to join me for a Foundation Worldview webinar to help our audience here at Foundation Worldview think critically about how they can help the kids in their care see God's design in science. So I'm excited that we actually have Dr. Miller on today with us. So Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so grateful to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. Well, as we start, could you just tell us, for those who are watching this webinar who aren't familiar with the Discovery Institute, could you just tell us a little bit about the Discovery Institute and what your role is there?
Certainly. Discovery Institute actually started in the early 1990s, around 91, and it was started by Bruce Chapman and a person named Gilder, who were experts more in policy and government. So they wanted to start a think tank that dealt with policy issues, things like regional issues in the Northwest, transportation. Eventually, they expanded into things like education and homelessness. But then in the mid-90s, what happened is they met a person named Stephen Meyer. And he was very interested in the evidence of design in nature. So then that excited the Institute. So they started the Center of Science and Culture 30 years ago. And what happened is it just gradually grew, where Steve wrote a few books. Other people wrote books like Phil Johnson, Michael Behe, Bill Dembski, Jonathan Wells. And eventually it expanded into a research program. So now we've got researchers around the world doing research, either showing the evidence of design in nature or showing how the assumption of design can help you do better research, make better predictions, give you greater understandings of things like biology. So I'm the research coordinator, so I help to oversee and support a lot of these research projects, and I do some of my own research.
Okay, wonderful. Well, yes, I know when I was at the summer seminar last year, that was one thing I was so impressed with. I was like, wow, they have experts in all of these different areas of the sciences, and they're like all here. And so I was very impressed with what I saw at the Discovery Institute last summer. Well, now just for a little bit of background on yourself, I know, just from hearing you talk and the little bit that I know about you, that you are both a committed Christian and you're a scientist. So could you just tell us a little bit about your faith journey and what role science has played in it?
Yeah, what happened was I went into college and I believed in God. I saw myself as a Christian, but I read Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. And I'm sure many of you know who he is. He's sort of one of the patron saints of atheism. And he was arguing that when you look at nature, all you see is blind, pitiless indifference. There is no evidence of design. And that anything that looks designed is simply an artifact of some natural process like natural selection. And then I also was challenged in other issues also, like did Jesus really rise from the dead? And I became pretty convinced for a while. that there really were these two types of people in the world. They're either people of science that were rational and logical and pursued the evidence, or they were people of faith that just kind of went with their feelings and their emotions.
Mm.
And they didn't listen to things like worldview centers or academies.
Mm.
And I remember becoming convinced that God didn't exist, that religion was just a psychological crutch. And I realized if God didn't exist and there really is no purpose in life, I'm just going to die. And it doesn't matter if I'm kind or cruel
Mm.
or happy or sad. Our whole species will just eventually go extinct. And then I looked up to the heavens. I said, God, I don't know if you exist. I think it was actually in my room. So I was looking at the ceiling and said, God, I don't know if you exist, but if you do exist, you have to prove it to me because I'm a scientist. I just can't do this
Mm.
blindly. And I thought maybe that's against the rules. Maybe faith just has to be blind. I didn't know. But God actually answered that prayer. And what happened was I just supernaturally, God put my life in connection with people that were leading scholars in science and
Mm.
philosophy, people that were experts in things like the reliability of the New Testament. And then I also experienced God in very personal ways, like just sort of supernatural encounters with God and things that are a little bit more subjective. But that really brought me back to faith. And what I realized
Mm.
through studying this issue, since before many of you may have been born on this podcast, I realized that a little science, and this is a famous quote, a little science often takes people away from God, but a lot of science consistently brings them back.
Mm.
Because when you look at the evidence of design, it's pervasive, that it really
Mm.
goes back to like Romans 1, where the Apostle Paul, talking to the Roman church, talked about how when you look at nature, you see hand of his divine power,
Mm.
his role in creation, and that people to deny the evidence actually have to suppress the truth. So that's
Mm.
kind of my experience.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I'm hoping for those who are watching and listening, I'm sure that somebody on here now or somebody that's going to watch one day has a child who has walked away
Mhm.
from the faith for similar reasons that you did. And I hope for all of you watching and listening that you find this as an encouragement to keep praying for those children and praying that similar things would happen, that God would put your children who have walked away from the faith in the path of people who are knowledgeable and who are going to point them back to the truth. And so I've never heard that before, that a little science leads people away from the faith, where a lot leads. Is that what you said? A little leads them away from the
Yeah,
faith,
and a
where a
lot will
lot
bring
leads.
them back to faith.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that. Actually, my sister, her husband will say that what actually gave him the courage to go, or the interest to go and ask her on a first date, is my sister was studying mathematics at the
Oh, wow.
university. And yeah, and they were just in a group conversation, and she was like, she's like, with my current level of understanding of mathematics, I don't understand how someone could be a mathematician and not believe in a God, like not believe that we were
Oh,
designed. And so that was
wow.
what he was like, oh wait, who is this girl?
Right, right.
And so I think, yeah, that's really neat to hear. So now, as we're thinking about Christianity and we're thinking of the sciences, we often hear that the Christian view of nature and the view that's taken by secular scientists is in conflict. So, could you briefly just walk us through the history of
Mhm.
conflicts between the Christian view of nature and the view taken by secular scientists?
Yeah, and it's really important to realize that this debate is not recent. It doesn't go back to
Mm.
Darwin or the Scopes trials. It goes back to about 500 BC.
Hmm.
So what happened right at the advent of what's considered philosophy, people like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, they argued that when you look at nature, it looks intelligible. It looks like there's a mind behind nature. There looks like there's purpose. But they were in debate with people called the atomists, and the atomists were materialist. And I'm sure because you're on this podcast, when I say materialist or materialism, I don't mean like Material Girl or Madonna, or I love lots of bling and nice cars and cash. But materialism is a philosophy that all that really influences the world is matter, energy, time, and chance. There is
Mm.
no higher power. There is no design. There is no God or gods at that time period involved in the world. And this debate was raging for centuries. In fact, when you go to Romans, when Paul is talking about this evidence of God's hand in creation, that's not in a vacuum. Because if
Mm.
you look at Acts 17, he was in Athens and he was at the Areopagus, which would be like the Harvard Center of Philosophy. And it talks about how he was engaging the Stoics and the Epicureans. And those are
Mm.
philosophers that were the descendants of people like the atomists and Plato and Aristotle.
Mm.
So the very same debates that we have today are the debates that Paul may have heard in conversation in Athens. So what happened in that time period is you had the Epicureans who believed, again, that everything was just matter and energy and time and chance. And they had language that was a bit different back then, versus the Stoics who believed that you saw God in creation. They were the early creationists. In fact, they believed that the strongest evidence of design, of God, was the human body, the human mind. So Paul was engaging in the very same debate. What happened is the church expanded. The evidence of design was so clear, and the early church leaders would talk about it. They would use language similar to Michael Behe's idea of irreducible complexity, but more in the context of that time. They'd say you'd see design in the way our planets move, and in the way that nature operates. Again, even going back to Jesus, who said, "Consider the lilies of the field, consider the birds, consider the plants." So he's again using this design argument where he's saying, when you look at the incredible order and design in nature, that shows you that God's power is the same at work in you, that he's designing your life, that he's at work in your life. And then what happened, though, is during the late Middle Ages, you go into the Enlightenment, that shifted. And initially what happened is you have the rise of modern science, people like Galileo and Kepler and Boyle. And what happened is they noticed that the universe operated according to certain rules, certain laws, certain mathematical formula. And that, in principle, could have given more credibility to this atomistic materialist view, but it didn't, because the early Christians recognized that in the same way that God created moral laws to give order to society, he created physical laws to order the universe. And they recognized that we're created in God's image. So we should have the ability to understand the order that God created. They also remember in Genesis, it's like go and basically be stewards of creation, which is essentially is like a call to science. It's part of the biblical mandate. And they also recognize that we are fallen, and because we're fallen, we can't simply trust our instincts. We have to do things like experimentation. We have to test things. So that's all these principles of our faith created the fertile foundation that allowed science to flourish. And what you find is that the early scientists weren't just, they weren't just sort of casual Christians. They were very devout Christians, and they saw that when you study nature, it was an act of devotion. It was an act of honoring God's creation. It was a way that we could, in a sense, understand the mind of God, think thoughts after him, which is a famous quote. What happened, though, is during after you transition from the Middle Ages to more what's called the Age of Enlightenment, you have philosophers that became very disenchanted with religion. And that's understandable, because you have different denominations that were treating each other very badly, to put it mildly. And then people said, well, we don't want all this conflict. Let's think about the world without God. So you have philosophers like Rousseau, and people like the famous, oh gosh, I'm sorry, who's the one who talked about against miracles? You've got David Hume.
Oh, Hume, yeah.
Yeah, you've got David Hume. And you have all these philosophers that are saying, let's rethink society without God. Let's just put him out of the picture. And a lot of them were essentially going back to some of this Greek atomistic tradition that used the same sort of arguments they used back then. And of course, with Charles Darwin, what happened is Darwin brought in this idea that when you see nature, you don't see evidence of a mind, but just chance and time. And people think Darwin's ideas were just out of the blue, but they weren't. Because in his autobiography he wrote for the world to read, he kind of portrayed himself as this objective scientist. But when you look at his private journals, you see a very different picture. What happened is he was really influenced by the free thinkers of his day. He went to a free thinking society when he was in Edinburgh. In fact, even his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had read this Latin poet named Lucretius, who was a first century BC poet. And Lucretius wrote a poem on nature that was trying to promote this materialist philosophy. He basically said that you have this netherworld, and in this netherworld you have different animal parts, and they randomly rearrange. And then some of the animals that come about by chance survive. They're fit to survive, and some are unfit, so they don't survive. And what happened is you find that Charles Darwin's ideas essentially were very similar to the ancient Greeks. The idea of natural selection was in a primitive form. The Greeks had the idea of hereditary information, of mutations, of gradual change. In fact, near the end of Darwin's life, he acknowledged that his ideas were very, very, very similar to Hippocrates.
Hmm.
So what happened is Darwin was deeply shaped by this materialistic philosophy, and he put that into his framework for studying biology. And also another interesting fact is that Charles Darwin, he studied William Paley, and Paley had the famous watchmaker argument,
Mhm.
where Paley said if you look at a watch, it has so many parts that are carefully designed for a purpose that fit together. You look at the human eye, you see the same evidence of design. And what Darwin did is he used the same arguments, the same examples, even the same cadence. And this was talked about by like Stephen Jay Gould in his famous treatise on evolution. But he replaced God with natural selection. So
Mhm.
natural
Mhm.
selection was essentially function like a demigod, so that whenever you see evidence of design in nature, you say it's not a designer. It looks designed, but it's natural
Mhm.
selection that's the
Mhm.
actual designer. And what happened is, as the philosophies of the materialist philosophies, the skepticism started to become more and more prevalent in the academies of Europe, they saw evolution as the secular creation narrative that could replace
Mhm.
Genesis.
Mhm.
So it was elevated from a theory to essentially a sacred creation narrative that defines reality. Some have even described it as a
Mhm.
religion in itself. People like Michael Ruse use that sort of
Mhm.
language, and he is an atheist. And he kind of was put. There's a lot of pushback on him for saying that, but that was something he mentioned. And what happens is you find that shaped how people understand science. So when people look at
Mhm.
science, you have famous philosophers and scientists who talk about how we have to look at the world from this materialistic viewpoint. There's a famous quote by Richard Levantin that says, if you look at the conflict between faith and science, he says, we take the side of science. And by science, he doesn't mean real science. He means more of a materialistic, I would say,
Mhm.
perversion of science. And we will deny evidence to design regardless of the evidence. And we'll accept any theory, no matter how implausible, no matter how counterintuitive, because
Wow.
we're not willing to let a divine foot in the door. And that's what sort of shaped the ethos
Hmm.
of the scientific community. So if you go to like a secular scientific institution, what happens is it functions very much like a cathedral giving worship to the materialist philosophy.
Mhm. Mhm.
And everyone is expected to embrace that philosophy and operate within it.
Mhm.
Now, the exciting news, which I'll talk about momentarily, is that the science is moving towards design so strongly.
Mhm.
Even in the main scientific circles, there is the sense that something dramatic has to change.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much for that overview because I hope for everybody who's watching and listening right now that you kind of have this picture in your mind right now. As you were saying, Dr. Miller, that this isn't just a debate that's been happening over the past 200 years, but it goes back, to 500 BC. And I think that's so helpful if we can help set up for our children that it's not just that the Christian view of nature has been in conflict with the secular view of nature for the past 200 years. But it was even back before Jesus's time that there was it the atomists? Is that who you said in the
Yeah,
beginning?
the atomists,
Dr.
yeah.
Miller? Yeah, that the atomists had this materialist view of the world. So, for those of you who have actually taken your kids through our comparative worldview curriculum here at Foundation Worldview, you know that one of the worldviews we cover is naturalism, which naturalism in its pure sense isn't completely identical to materialism, but the way we present it in the curriculum, it would be basically the same thing. And so we want to help our kids see that there have been two competing views for a very long time. And so you just kind of alluded to this in what you left off at the end, but just where kind of where science is today. And so we won't jump to like where science is headed yet. But can you just talk with us through what are some of the major challenges that
Mhm.
Christians have recently faced from secular scientists?
Yeah, and what you find is this materialist scientific framework has really shaped not just science, but it shapes everything from law to psychology to
Mhm.
business philosophy to education. So what you find is that when you go to, let's say, a secular institution, no matter what discipline you're studying, there's this backdrop where this backdrop is this narrative that either God doesn't exist or he's not involved in the world. And you just get your mind is captured by that narrative. It's like all around you.
Mhm.
It's like the movie The
Mhm.
Matrix, which is a fun movie I watched long ago. And what happened, that's one of my assigned watchings is when I do worldview conversations is The Matrix
Mm,
or The Truman Show
good one.
or something like that. And what happens though is in the science, the message is constantly presented that life is an accident. Life is
Mhm.
the result of natural selection, the survival of the fittest. And that stories repeated everywhere. Like I was reading a book on just how to write better, how to do stories, and it had this evolutionary backdrop to it, and people just sort of
Mhm.
mix it in the conversations. So
Yeah.
that would be sort of front and center of the challenge, and that leads into psychology. So when you look at, let's say, a counseling program that you take, they come from the perspective that the brain just evolved over time. There's just sort of these
Mhm.
mechanistic structures in there. And you do things just like behaviorist type counseling, where you just simply try to change your behaviors, or
Mhm.
you simply try to do external stimuli. And that there can be benefit to that. There's benefit in what they're doing, but it misses the big picture. It misses
Mhm.
this picture that we're created by God. And the reason we get depressed, the reason we have relational tensions, is because we're not living in alignment with God's desires. We don't have
Mhm.
a connection with with the Holy Spirit that's bringing us life and bringing us peace. So what happens is if you go to a secular school and you learn about cognitive brain science or psychology, you're taught essentially that the way we live life is if we're an accident of nature, and that has enormous impacts.
Mhm.
And that's why you see that so many attempts to bring mental health to people have failed. And that
Mhm.
then gets into these deeper problems, like, is there such a thing as gender, or should a person change their gender? Is that a good idea? And
Mhm.
it kind of makes sense
Mhm.
if we're an accident of nature and sex is just something that happened because of certain selective pressures. It's probably something fairly fluid and wouldn't be a big deal. But if we're created by God, or created
Mhm.
by God to be male and female, and that's meant to have certain types of relationships, then if you go outside those relationships, it's going to create breakdown. It's going to create harm. It's going to start to
Mhm.
erode the foundation of society. So I'd
Mhm.
say that that issue of are we an accident and the auxiliary
Mhm.
hypothesis, like is there such a thing as gender, are some of the biggest challenges that Christians have to deal with today.
Mm. I love the way that you broke that down because I was just thinking. So, for those of you who are watching, when you're talking with your kids, one of the questions that you can ask them just on a regular basis as you're looking at all parts of life is how would we view this, X fill in the blank differently if we viewed humans as being body and soul image bearers of the holy God, or if we viewed humans purely as physical bodies who got here accidentally. I mean, we can ask that when shopping in the grocery store. Like how is our food choices going to be impacted by what we believe about where we came from? Or, when we're getting ready to go to the doctor, like how would a doctor's view of you and how they treat you be different if they viewed you as body and soul image bearer created by God versus accidental body who just got here without any purpose. So for anyone working with kids anywhere between the ages of 4 on up, you can ask those questions because like you said, Dr. Miller, like this just has implications on everyday life. Actually, I was I think I kind of bored friends a little bit recently. I had to close the conversation because I was like, oh, nobody's interested in this. But we were driving through a city and I was looking at these buildings that were created more of like a brutalist style in architecture. And I
Mhm.
was like, oh my goodness, do you know that this actually stems down to the architecture's worldview? That when you view humans as just accidentally evolved animals who all they need is shelter, clothing, food, I was like, you're not trying to design for beauty. And so everybody's kind of like, what are you talking about? I was like, never mind, we'll talk about this later. But it's true. It impacts like every area of a
Mhm.
life. So thanks for walking us through that. So, one question that I know is on a lot of people's mind, just thinking through
Mhm.
what are some of the different views today in the church about the relationship between faith and science? So, what should we be aware of as different views in the church?
Yes, and let me deal with the most complicated issue, which is the age of the Earth,
Mm,
and that's something I'm sure many of you are interested in. And what's happened is the secular scientific community has presented a strong case that the Earth and the universe is old, and that understandably has created some tensions with how you interpret Genesis. Is Genesis saying it's a literal 6 days? If that's the case, how does that fit with the fossil record in terms of the way
mhm,
that people in the secular society look at it? And that's a very complex question that Christians will debate very strongly about. And some Christians feel, for very, very good reasons, that it's important for Christians to embrace a literal 6 day creation about 10,000 years ago, plus or minus. And if you question that part of the Bible, then you really are questioning the foundation that has implications. And I have friends that are in organizations like Institute Creation Research, and what they're trying to do is they're trying to come up with a scientific framework that will explain the data as well or better than the secular scientists did from their framework. And of course, there's other Christians who would argue that the evidence of design or the evidence of an old earth is real. And they feel that it's legitimate to interpret Genesis and other passages in scripture like Exodus 20 within a framework of what they would call an old earth. People like reasons to believe. And they've argued that it's a perfectly legitimate interpretation so that you have this consistency between an old earth and that interpretation of Genesis. And I've actually done an article for Logos Bible software that talks about these different views on the age of the earth. So you can look that up. And both sides have very good points. So the young earth creationist community would say that they're concerned that the old earth creationist community are not being entirely accurate with their interpretation of scripture. That trying to fit it within an old earth framework is creating really tensions with scripture that are greater than the tensions of the scientific evidence with the young earth. And they have confidence that over time they'll be able to show how all the evidence fits better in the young earth perspective. Well, the old earth community would feel that the tensions between a young earth and science are greater than the tensions with scripture. And they feel that with time and as we understand more about the historical cultural context, they'll be able to harmonize very well scripture with an old earth. And that's a very serious debate, which won't be ending anytime soon. And my encouragement is that it's a real tension. It's good for Christians to wrestle with this. It's important. But I would argue that the difference between your typical Christian that embraces a historic creationist perspective and a Christian who embraces more of an old earth perspective is far less of a tension than the tension between people that want to deny the overwhelming evidence of the resurrection and deny that Jesus was God in the flesh, or the tension between the idea that nature shows clear evidence of design, and then those people that want to suppress the truth about that design. So it's a real tension, but it's one that's minor compared to what unites us. And people like Philip Johnson have said that before he passed, is I think it's important for Christians to have a very united front and really point out this idea that we see design. And even if you do accept the dating methods of the secular scientific community, you still can't escape the fact that the universe has a beginning. You still can't escape the fact that the laws of nature are designed. You still can't escape the fact that life is designed. So it's important for us to be unified, present that, but in our own circles to realize we are wrestling with more of those issues. So that's a major issue. Now, I would say that other challenges that Christians face have to be addressed much more decisively. So this idea that we are an accident of nature is not true at all. That if you look at the fossil record, regardless if you interpret it from an old earth or young earth perspective, what do you see? You see things appear suddenly and don't change. So that's things just kind of appear, created, and they don't change. And then what people would describe as what are called transitional fossils or missing links are not really transitional fossils. So let me use an analogy to help you understand what's happening. Imagine aliens came to Earth and we had all left, like in the movie WALL-E, and they go through this dig of this trash heap. And what do they find? They find these beautiful lineages of artifacts like a unicycle, a bicycle, a moped, a motorcycle, a station wagon, a bus. And look, what incredible evidence of evolution. I mean, it must have all evolved from some self-replicating factory that had an automated process that was mutating. Because look at these linear, look at that progression. Look at these intermediate artifacts. We've got a moped, which is halfway between a bicycle and a motorcycle. I mean, how could you deny that that's a transitional artifact? But it's not. It's a hybrid design, because when engineers recognize that they want to achieve goals that are achieved by two different designs, like a bicycle and a motorcycle, they will borrow features of those two different design logics and create something entirely new, but that brings in what's best of those two different design logics. So moped has a motor very similar to a large motorcycle, but it's smaller, it's more efficient, it uses less gas. It also is more streamlined like a bicycle, so you can maneuver better. And that's what you see in nature. Like what people have called transitional fossils, like if you've seen the whale series, or you've heard of things like Archaeopteryx or Tiktaalik. These are not true transitions. They're like mopeds. They're simply designed to have these common features. But the overall picture is that things appear suddenly and don't change. Now, another false claim that people have heard is that life looks badly designed. And I don't know if you ever heard this, like the appendix doesn't work, that our ACL breaks, so it's badly designed, or our eyes are wired backwards. None of that's true. In fact, secular scientists have known for decades that most of those examples are not true. But it's sort of what you have is people are not just taught evolution as a sort of scientific idea, but more as a faith tradition. So you sort of have this catechism where students are given all these arguments for evolution, many of which are known to be false or have been seriously challenged or are entirely based on circular reasoning. Like there is no real evidence that evolutionary processes have creative power. That's not the case. So again, what you're finding is these are great challenges, and Christians have to really understand how to respond to those challenges.
Yeah. Well, thank you for highlighting those, just the ones like the kind of in-house talk where there's some tension and it's not going to be, like you said, not going to be resolved anytime soon between old earth creationism, young earth creationism. But then the other things that our kids will inevitably face as they're out in society and learning science. So what I'd love to do now is to kind of like zero in really on how we can talk with our kids about science, because I'm assuming that, a few people in this webinar might have expertise in one area of the sciences or more. However, I do not. I am not a scientist. That is not my area of expertise. And I'm assuming that most people who are watching this either live and those who will watch it in the future are not experts in the sciences. But what we all have in common, aside from our unity in Christ, is that we all have a desire to help the children that God has placed in our care see his hand in science. So what are some practical ways that we can point our children towards God's design in creation?
Well, one thing is go in nature. I mean, go on walks and ask the children to talk about what they see. What do they see that's working in harmony with each other? What do they see that reflects God's desire to love his creation, to love people? Like what is out there that really is what gives beauty? How is it beautiful? Teach them to make observations. Like it was, there's a famous story, and I can't remember if it was Isaac Newton or if it was Michelangelo, but basically his parents said, well, why don't you sit down and write out what you see about a candle? So what they did was he actually wrote hundreds of observations about a candle. He drew pictures. So teach children to be observant, to study nature, to ask questions, to watch documentaries. If you go to intelligentdesign.org, that is a site where we have videos that really show the beauty and the wonder of creation. And then it will be really nice is even have engineers and biologists come together for dinner and ask, well, how would you design this? Like, how would you design a hummingbird? How hard would that be? If you talk to someone that works at Boeing that designs aircraft, they'd say, we can't design anything even remotely similar to this. The way it works, its elegance, its beauty is just astonishing. Watch nature documentaries. And again, what I really like to do is if people don't agree with me, I want to understand what they believe as well or better than how they understand it. So I think a big mistake Christians have done is they've instilled fear of science in Christians. They said, well, you don't want to become a scientist because there's all these people that are going to lie to you and it's all, controlled by Satan and all this. And there really is deception. There really is false ideas, but there's also God's common grace. That there is a sense that science is an institution ordained by God, and there's really people that want to do what's right. They want to promote the truth. And Christians should go into the science and celebrate that. They should celebrate what they're doing that's beneficial. But then, like Daniel, what's amazing about Daniel is he was sent in the Old Testament. He was sent to Babylon for a 3-year training program. Gosh, that kind of sounds like college. And he learned the language and the ways of Babylon, but he always filtered it through a Christian framework, or in that time, a Jewish framework. So he wouldn't do what was harmful. He wouldn't believe what was false, but he then created a synthesis where what he did was like 10 times better than what everyone else had. So as Christians, I think it's really important if you've got students or children who really have love for engineering or biology or philosophy or poetry or whatever it is, have them start reading early, have them start learning, not just Christian sources, but secular sources. Then have them dialogue with them about what do you see as good? What can we celebrate? What do you
Mm.
see that might be off, and how can you use your faith principles to do it even better?
Mm.
One of my favorite examples is a man named Stuart Burgess. He's one of my heroes in the faith. He's one of the top engineers in the UK. How did he become a top engineer, you might ask? Well, he is a Christian and he knew that life was designed. So he studied life very carefully
Mm.
and he copied the design of life into his engineering. So his Christian faith gave him a kind of a cheat code. He kind of knew things that his secular counterparts didn't. And that's why he became one of the top engineers in his country. He helped
Mm.
design satellites. He actually designed the bicycle gear system that allowed them to win the Olympics and
Wow.
beat us. So don't feel bitter about that. He's a good guy. But again, it was his faith where
Mm.
he celebrated the secular knowledge, like engineering. He
Mm.
filtered out what was bad, like the claim that life is badly designed. He then brought his faith to study biology, and he did something better than everybody else practically.
Mm.
He also has shown by bringing engineering into biology how life is not just well designed, but it looks like it's as well designed as you could possibly imagine.
Mm.
In fact,
Mm.
he looked at all these claims about how the human limbs are poorly designed, or ACL is badly designed because it breaks, or eyes are wired backwards. When he looked at it from the lens of an engineer, he says the reason biologists believe that is because they've never studied engineering. But then he showed how it was designed as well as it could possibly design. In fact, some
Mm.
aspects of life are are as well designed as might be theoretically possible based on the physics.
Mm.
In fact, he has this book out called Ultimate Engineering that I'd encourage all of your kids to read carefully.
Mm.
And what he talked about is this beautiful example of how when you try to build robotic limbs, it's really hard because it's hard to get this balance of flexibility and strength and range of motion. But our knee, our hands, everything is designed as well as it can be designed to get the ultimate range of motion with the greatest strength, with the greatest flexibility. And what's happened is the ingenuity is astonishing. But one of my favorite examples is if you look at, let's say, your joints, there's this fluid in your joints, and the friction is like 50 times, it's much, much lower than the friction of anything we can design. In fact, it may be as low friction as theoretically possible based on the physics. In the same way, our eyes have photoreceptors, and the photoreceptors can detect a single photon, a single point of light. So it is as sensitive as theoretically possible. Our muscles are as strong as theoretically possible. So again, you're seeing what he called ultimate engineering, but
Mm.
but other biologists didn't have that insight
Mm.
because they were blinded by the secular worldview.
Mm.
Other engineers didn't have the cheat code because they didn't really think of looking to life. He did, and that's what caused him to excel. Do that in everything from philosophy to
Mm.
medicine to psychology to counseling. And what you'll find is you will excel beyond your counterparts because you're
Mm.
celebrating the good in the secular world, but you're challenging what's wrong and producing something 10 times better.
Hmm. I love that. I love that example, and I was actually thinking of that recently in my own life because there's a woman at my church who has her doctorate in pharmacology, and she works
Hmm.
at a research hospital, and she was talking about how they were just having this problem with women, going through some postpartum depression and looking at one of the hormones that was released, after they had given birth, and what they were prescribing was something that would actually just suppress that hormone,
Hmm.
because they're like, oh, this is what it's causing, and I just asked her, I was like, how does your, like Christian worldview influence, what you do? And she's like, oh, I'm so happy that you're asking me. And she told me how just recently she had asked a question that no one else in her lab was asking because
Hmm.
she believes that life was designed. And so she asked, well, what was this hormone designed to do? And so they were actually dove in to look at, is this actually doing anything beneficial for the woman after she's given birth? And they found out all these benefits to it. So then they started prescribing something different, not to suppress that hormone. I was like, wow, like what an amazing question to ask, that nobody else was thinking of because of their commitment to materialism. Um, so for parents who just heard that, I just want to make sure that you don't miss just these really practical tips that Dr. Miller just gave. Something that you can do this afternoon, if it's not snowing or raining, where you are, is just go for a walk in the woods with your kids and ask those two questions that Dr. Miller gave at the beginning. What do we see right now that's working in harmony in nature? What parts of nature are working together? Then ask the question, how do we see God's love for his creation in what we see in nature? Like, I was thinking, even just a few years ago, I went on a walk in this trail that runs through my neighborhood with a friend. And I was like, you know what? I am so grateful for this trail, because when it is like 90 degrees in the middle of August, the trees are full of leaves and they shade us from the sun. Like, that's so amazing. I was like, and in the winter, when it's actually cold, like when it's only like in the 40s or 50s and I want to be warmed up, all the leaves are off the trees and the sunlight shines through. And the friend was like, yeah, almost as if it was designed for us. And I was like, oh, I never thought of that before. I was just thinking like, oh, how lucky are we, that this heats us in the winter and keeps us cool in the summer. And I was like, you're right. Like, this does speak to design. So I think that's a really practical activity that you guys can do with your kids. And then Dr. Miller, another thing that I thought was such a good recommendation is find the people in your church who are in the sciences and have them over for dinner and ask them questions about what they do, or even somebody who's in engineering, and ask them questions about what they do so that your kids can learn from these individuals. And then I also loved your recommendation for our more science minded kids, and even those who aren't, to have them be reading scientific literature and even some things that are secular. And we don't want to just have our kids on the lookout for what is not true. Like, do we want them to be on the lookout? Yes, we do want them to be on the lookout for things that aren't true, but to look at, okay, what truths can we find in this? Because by God's common grace, truth is accessible to all. And so even in scientific literature that's going to be written from a more materialistic perspective, there are going to be nuggets of truth in there. And so we don't want to just like swipe all that aside, but to teach our kids to actually learn, what can we glean from this? So I hope that those are, three just real practical boots on the ground things that you can do in your homes or your classrooms or your churches. Go on that nature walk, ask those questions, have people over for dinner who are in the sciences, and let your kids learn from them. And then immerse your kids in scientific literature. Now, I don't mean for those of you with 6-year-olds that you have to go to the scientific periodicals. I mean, you can just get books on the sciences out of the kids section of the library and be reading through them. And what can we learn from this? Now, Dr. Miller, a question that I have for you now is, as we think of our kids who are more drawn towards the sciences, I imagine for a parent who's not in the sciences but has a child who's very drawn to the sciences, this could feel a little bit more intimidating. But what are some ways that we as Christians can encourage our children in the pursuit of science, if they have more of that natural bent?
Yeah, and again, I remember when I was growing up, I adored nature documentaries. I remember I would go to camping with my parents up in lakes of the north in Michigan, and we would have this campsite. But then if you go to like the main area with like the bathrooms, they'd broadcast every Saturday night nature documentaries, and I used to love those. I still remember this documentary about ants and termites battling each other. It's like it was seared into my brain. I remember learning about the octopus. Oh my gosh! I mean, the octopus, like the way it camouflages. I don't know if you knew this, but its tentacles actually are part of the brain. There's actually part of the brain, and their arms act independently. It's incredible. So really, really, really important. A wonder of nature. Help find documentaries. Help find books that are accessible. Talk to scientists about what they're doing. If you've got scientists in your church or friends, have them come over and share the frontiers of science. Again, at Discovery Institute, we have lots of videos that really explore the wonder of creation. Read books, and again, if you want to go into sciences, and Stuart Burgess actually mentioned something that was really sad to me. And I run a team of scientists and engineers working together to help create a theory of biological design from a design perspective. And we've got people volunteering their time that are helping to write research papers. So the amount of money that goes into a research paper could be like $100,000, $200,000 at a university. They're volunteering their time. So it's incredible. And I was always amazed at the quality of the work. And Stuart and I were talking, and we said that, well, often in the research academy, what happens is there's so much pressure to go on almost like this obstacle course. You have to have so many publications, you have to do this, so that people lose the passion for science.
Hmm.
They just publish papers for the sake of publishing papers. At the end of the time, they're so cynical. They just want to get a paycheck. It's just really sad.
Hmm.
So again, my encouragement is to keep that love of science and even consider working in alternative institutions that may be outside the norm, where you can do really good science without the same pressures you might find in a secular institution.
Hmm.
I encourage you, if you want to go into biology, study engineering, to study computer programming, study artificial intelligence, but understand that there's so much hype about artificial intelligence. It's really exaggerated. So if I were you, I would study people like George Montañez. He has a YouTube channel that's talking about this. But understand how artificial intelligence is a great tool, but it's also very limited what it can do. Understand how humans are needed. There's this video George put out called Model Breakdown. And what happens if you feed AI the products of AI, it becomes more and more nonsensical, that you have to have human intelligence with our unique abilities for creativity to feed the beast, so to speak. But learn how to use AI effectively, but don't let it replace your critical thinking. I encourage you, get off social media. Just really partition a small amount of time for it, but understand that so many students' brain wiring is changing because they're on social media all the time. They play video games all the time. They are into quick dopamine hits. They don't want to think critically. They don't want to read academic literature. Encourage your children to read harder and harder literature to keep their minds engaged, to read philosophy, talk with other people with deep conversations about these things, learn the tools of logic and reason and rhetoric, so that you really prepare yourself so that when you go into your profession, you can be a leader in the field. Those are just, and occasionally do read the scientific literature, like go through Nature, go through and stretch yourself. You should be reading things you understand, but you'd always feel stretched. And as you stretch yourself and you learn more, you'll grow. In fact, I remember reading this book. It was a graduate school textbook on post-modernity I read when I was in grad school. And I have a physics PhD. And I remember reading the textbook, and for the first page, it took me like an hour because I had to look up every single word. So I had to look at every single word. And if I didn't understand a concept, I'd look it up. But eventually, by halfway through the book, I was flying through it. And it wasn't a problem because most barriers are just the language, it's some of the ideas. But once you overcome that barrier, you would be shocked at what you can understand. And even in high school, become an expert in something, become really knowledgeable. Use your time well that God has given you. Those are just sort of recommendations that come to
Yeah, love that. So just to make sure that nobody missed this, the Discovery Institute, their YouTube channel has so many great documentaries and other, shorts and videos on science. So I had to watch a lot of videos on that YouTube channel last summer for the seminar. And I posted a lot of them on my personal Facebook page and was just like, parents, this would be a great one to go through with your kids. So highly recommend that you check out that YouTube channel. And then love that recommendation at the end for reading and pushing our kids in reading. And so for those of you who have kids or are working with kids who are in middle school or more towards the high school, those recommendations for, keeping them off social media, pushing them towards literature that might be hard for them, but to grow in that, great recommendation. And then for those of you who are working with younger kids who are just learning how to read or are getting good at that, highly recommend, and we recommend this so often at Foundation Worldview, that you're really intentional about the time that your children are spending on visual media and getting them out in nature, getting them outside, giving them more opportunities to grow in responsibility so that their brain is developing in the way that God designed it to develop, that it's not really being stunted just by those easy dopamine hits that you mentioned, Dr. Miller. And then with reading, this is something that you can push your kids in, that as you read aloud to them, and now this is most read alouds are going to be fiction. So this is different than what we have been talking about. But even as you do fiction read alouds, your kids are going to be so engrossed in that they're going to want to do more reading like that on their own. And that's going to push them to start to read harder and harder things. Because like if you're reading, I don't know, if you're reading the Chronicles of Narnia or you're reading the Wing Feather Saga or the Green Ember series, your child is no longer going to be satisfied with just reading the Magic Tree House. They're going to want to read other series like that. And that's going to push them in their ability to read, which then you can help transfer over into nonfiction reading as well. So love those recommendations. Well, just as a warning for everybody, in the next 5 minutes or so, we are going to transition into our time of questioning. So if you have a question about something that was said or something that was not said, now is the time to put it in. Again, put it in the chat and just put a capital Q to mark that it is a question, and we will, Lord willing, get to that. So just as we're wrapping up this conversation, one thing that I'd love to talk through is how can we help prepare our children for the challenges that they will face in the secular scientific community. So especially those kids that are more drawn towards the sciences and that we really think that God is gifted in that way and will, Lord willing, go into that one of those fields. How can we prepare them for the challenges that they are going to face in the secular scientific community?
Well, I think there's a lot of important preparation. Like, this may seem odd, but I think learning about emotional intelligence is really important. Because when you talk to scientists, what happens is, just because of the history of our nation, there's a lot of emotions that go behind this. So like some professors who are secular professors feel like Christians said they're just, they're just servants of Satan, and they're in a lot of things. And they're like, I just want to do my research. And there's a lot of wounding there. So I think it's important for students to learn how to talk to people gently, graciously, and wisely with these issues. Also, there's a lot of Christians. So if you talk to a lot of Christians in the secular scientists, they've felt like they were misled, like perhaps their church used very outdated materials, the science wasn't very good, and they feel like they were tricked. They feel like that they were even bullied into accepting a viewpoint that wasn't necessarily right. And you'll want to be very gracious for people like that. A lot of Christians have embraced the evolutionary framework, and they've done so in a way that's not that they're rebelling against God. They just feel that's where the science is. They feel that the science they heard in church wasn't necessarily that high quality. So be very gentle with them, because they have a lot of emotional woundings from their past. So just be gracious, encourage them just to look at the assumptions. And I find often with people, you've got to listen to them very carefully. Like one of our colleagues, he went to a Harvard program after his PhD, and he was very good at listening to people, what they believed, what they thought, and then figuring out what their ideas were, and then sharing his ideas in a way that was wise. And what happened was he found that 20% of the people he encountered, maybe 25%, were very open to design, but they were terrified to talk about it. And that was just sort of an interesting observation. You have to learn wisdom, because it's kind of like, if you're going into this realm where there's such hostility towards traditional Christian views and design, you need to be as wise as serpent, as innocent as doves. You have to learn to walk in the wisdom of the power of the Holy Spirit, to know when you share your ideas and when you don't. You have to use lots of wisdom, because if you want to go into the sciences and people know you're a Christian and they know you believe in design, they'll work behind the scenes to make sure that you fail in your profession. They will talk to professors not to hire you. So you have to really pray for wisdom of when you share what and with whom. You've got to understand the secular ideas better than they do even, and you've got to be productive. You've got to produce good research. So I recommend a lot of you, maybe if you go into a lab as an undergraduate, you do good research. And what happens is, when you prove yourself, you have a platform that you can then share your ideas. So you can talk very slowly about your ideas. You can start with this design in the laws of nature. That's fairly safe. And then you can work your way into what's happening in the biological sciences, because what you're finding in the top level biological sciences is going more towards design. There's a man named Michael Levin, and he's part of what's called the Third Way evolutionists. And he wrote a book called Evolution on Purpose. It was produced by MIT, and they're talking about how cognition and purpose is everywhere in biology. So you can understand how the secular literature is falling into these ideas, and then you can cautiously share more ideas as you get to know a person better. And you have to be able to read people. You've got to have a deep prayer life. I encourage you to read theology. I encourage you to read some of the old theologians who are systematic, that you really understand your faith, not just an emotional level, but a deep, deep intellectual level, but also at an emotional level. You want to have God shape your emotions in a healthy way, deal with woundings and all these other issues, so that when you go into these environments, you're a full person, you're fully discipled, you eat healthy, you exercise, So everything about you is strong and fit and ready for this challenge. And then always look at people with grace and kindness, because they're not the enemy. It's more of they're trapped in a false narrative. And your job is to embody kindness and goodness in the presence of God, and then put the right truth at the right time in the right way to help break them free from these false ideas. The danger is when a Christian is almost like a butcher with a bloody hatchet. They present truth to you, and as opposed to a surgeon with a surgical instrument, they know how to cut and to hit the right area at the right time. So those are different ways you can prepare yourself to go into these disciplines, and also find a network of people. We have a summer seminars program that you could come to. We've got a Roots program. If you email Discovery, we've got a Roots program where we create networks of parents and schools, churches, to really be aware of this evidence of design and what are the best resources out there. So again, these are different resources you can tap into to keep that. Start your community now is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
Pray for you now. If your parents, ask your children where are you going into. If they want to go into science, say, we're going to pray with you every Sunday about you being called into the sciences and how you can bring truth and goodness in that field. People have this idea of spirituality where it's like being spiritual means you don't act naughty, you know the right theology, but being spiritual is bringing the truth of God and the power of God into every area of your life. So pray with your students about their future careers. And study scripture related to their future career. So there are just different ways you can help prepare yourself.
Love that. A whole bunch of different ways there. I really loved that analogy, or the visual of the difference between a butcher and a surgeon, that we want to train our kids to act with wisdom, to not use truth as a butcher knife, but as a surgeon's scalpel. So love that. And I was not expecting your first part of that response to be talking about emotional intelligence and wisdom, but I can totally see why that would be so important. And so I think one thing I was just thinking of my own life, and one thing I'm so grateful that my parents did. Now, at the time, it would drive me nuts. It like absolutely drove me nuts. But now, later in life, I'm so grateful that they did this. Is whenever I would get into a conflict with someone, or something would go wrong at school or with a friend, my parents, one of their first questions to me was, how do you think the other person is viewing this? Or how do you think the other person is feeling? And that would drive me nuts, because I'm like, all I want you to do is just give me a hug and tell me that this other person is terrible. And that is what emotionally I wanted at the time. But and now I don't do this perfectly, but by God's grace, hopefully I'm growing in this. But that is one of the first questions that comes to my mind now when I'm in a conflict with someone, is how is this person viewing this? How are they feeling about this? And so I think training our kids to ask that is so helpful. For those of you who have taken your kids through our careful thinking curriculum here at Foundation Worldview, you know that the first 5 units are all focused on the laws of logic and reasoning and looking at evidence and how we evaluate evidence. And then the final unit is all on how do we communicate well? How do we ask good questions? How do we genuinely listen to someone? I think my favorite activity from that whole curriculum is an activity where the kids have to ask a question to someone and roll a tennis ball to them, and the person explains their answer and rolls the tennis ball back. And then the child has to say, what I heard you say was, and then they say it in their own words, and then ask, is that correct? And they roll the ball back, and they either hear if it was correct or no, and then they have to listen again. But if we can train our kids in that, I think that's so important. And then I love how you gave the recommendation just of the Discovery Institute. So for anyone who has older children who are interested in the sciences, I highly recommend that you check out the resources that the Discovery Institute has. As I mentioned, the summer seminar that I was part of last summer, there were many students there. Most of them were graduate or doctoral students. However, there were several undergrad students as well who were studying the sciences. And I know that was, like I gleaned stuff from the seminar, but for them, it was like even more valuable in not only the information that was presented, but in the relationships that were built and in the guidance that was given in how do you wisely walk as a scientist in, like a community that is not right now in favor of intelligent design. So as we're preparing to transition to questions, can you just tell us a little bit of where the future of science is headed, specifically in regards to intelligent design?
Okay, I'm really excited about this, because I talked about this pendulum of philosophy that can take centuries for a single move of the pendulum. Where back in the day, there was a sense that there was the debate between is there design, is there not design. In the Middle Ages, it was very much design. And today, it's very much not design. But the pendulum is shifting back. And what you're seeing in
Mm.
science is even secular scientists are realizing, hey, this looks like there's design behind it. They don't want to use that language, but it's where we're headed. So let me give you a few
Mm.
examples. Let's talk about evolution. Like people often will say, well, microevolution's true. You really see Darwin got that right. You've got finch beaks that change, and the macro is kind of messed up. But micro, that turns out not to be the case. He was wrong largely about microevolution too.
Mm.
What you find is if you look at like cichlid fish, and you put a pair of these fish in like Lake Victoria in Africa or in some other lake, they will diversify very fast. Like in a matter of years,
Mm.
what will happen is you'll see multiple different types of these cichlid fish. Some have larger jaws, smaller jaws. They have different coloration, different spine structures. And what happens is people said, oh my gosh, look at this incredible microevolution. But as it turns out, it's not random mutations and selection, that organisms are designed to monitor the environment. And what happens, they've got built-in structures that take that information, have sort of a logical way to analyze it, and then they will direct like a juvenile fish to turn into an adult in very different ways. You
Mm.
have like these gulls, these birds, that if they're in salty water, they actually develop like an extra organ. It just appears to filter out the salt, and if they go to a different environment, it can go away. So what we're finding is that if you look at a human tracking system like an automated car, it monitors the environment, and then when it responds to challenges, it has this pre-programmed response, and that's what we see in life. And I think the person in the Christian circles that really stumbled across this most dramatically is Randy Galuza. He's actually currently the head of Institute of Creation Research, and he really was ahead of the game by I think everybody. And he was looking at the top level scientists, and he realized that hey, this is design. This isn't random. Even if you look at scientists like Jim Shapiro, they're talking about how even mutations are not random always. What you
Mm.
have, like in dogs, for instance, we see all this genetic variety in dogs, but a lot of that is because you have this region of the gene. Forgive me for technical language. I believe they're called tandem repeats that change like much more often than other random genetic changes, and that's what targets genetic changes right where it gives you the best
Mm.
variation that allows all the different dogs. You've got bacteria that when they respond to challenges will target faster genetic changes in certain regions that help them to explore different possibilities when they're under attack.
Mm.
What you're finding is even the genetic variation, the differences in genes from different species appears designed. So you have genes that are linked together. I just read this article where these packages of genes are linked together and they're reversed so that they won't be split apart in what's called crossover,
Mm.
because these packages of genes are helpful in specific environments. So it seems like even the genetics is designed to allow organisms to adapt very fast to different
Mm.
environments. Like in cichlid fish, you'll find you'll have put different cichlid fish in the same environmental conditions, and you'll see the same genetics in like 500 locations that all will converge in the same way to help this
Mm.
environment. So that's exciting. Also, engineering. We're working on a theory of biological design based on engineering. We're taking the basic theory we've had about how design is a better framework, but we're giving teeth to it. We're
Mm.
saying here's a library of patterns that you will see. Here's a process to do biological research to bring in engineering into it. And we've published papers. We were seeing things other people aren't seeing. And again, what you're also seeing is people have historically talked about design in terms of design of our planet for life, design of the laws of nature for life, design of life for optimality. But again, what you're seeing is design parameters work together in symphonic harmony to allow things like human technology and scientific advancement. Like, why do we have high resolution vision? Well, it's because the laws of nature allow for there to be light that can travel through a vacuum. That's not easy. We've got photoreceptors that detect the light. But what's amazing is the wavelength of light is perfect for the optics of the eye, particularly the human eye, because it
Mm.
produces a high resolution image right on the retina. If the wavelength of light were much longer, our eyes would have to be the size of football fields to have the same resolution.
Gosh.
And remarkably, the photoreceptors have to be a certain size to detect the photons if it's very low light. Well, the highest resolution possible based on the smallest photoreceptor matches the resolution based on the optics. So you're seeing this convergence of design of our, and you'll love this. Our sun produces the perfect amount type of radiation, light and heat. It doesn't produce a lot of the nasty stuff. Our atmosphere happens to block the nasty stuff and allow light and heat through. Water just so happens to block the nasty radiation, allow light and heat through. So again, you're seeing symphonic harmony as design works together. One more example, fire. The only way you have technology is with fire. Well, the oxygen levels and the nitrogen levels in our atmosphere are not just perfect for breathing. If we had more oxygen, our body would erode like a rotten apple core. If we had too little oxygen, we couldn't have activities at such a high level. We need the energy. But also the oxygen is perfect for fire. If you had more oxygen or less nitrogen, which acts like a retardant, fires would burn down if we had too much oxygen, it would burn down our forests, like in California every so often. If we had too little oxygen or too much nitrogen, you couldn't produce enough fire to melt metals to allow for technology. It just so happens that the structure of our planet doesn't just allow for life, but all of the minerals and materials useful for technology are at the surface, collected together. Even you have bacterial mats in biology that helps to super concentrate materials that we need. So again, this is, I think, a frontier of research, which is highly unexplored, is just the fact that the different design parameters and different disciplines work together for a purpose that God intended. That's where we're heading.
Love that. And love the excitement and the passion. So for all of you who have children who are more drawn towards the sciences, I hope that Dr. Miller is inspiring you to really have your kids dive deep into this, that this is an exciting field, and I'm probably not even speaking of this correctly since I'm not in the sciences myself. But I hope that for those of you who have kids that are interested in this, you're catching this passion, this excitement, that this is an exciting opportunity, that God has designed your children in this way. So we're going to transition into our time of questions. So I know that for those of you who are watching live, that you've already been on with us for an hour and 10 minutes. So thank you for devoting this much of your day. If you have to scoot, obviously you're welcome to scoot at any time, but just know that this webinar is being recorded. So you will be able to get a copy of this. You'll be able, if you have to leave, you'll be able to get the questions. So we'll probably go into about a 10-minute time of Q&A. Okay, so the first question that we have is, how do you tackle the different views in the scientific community and even about creationists about young Earth versus old Earth? This is a topical I struggle with, for example, when talking about dinosaurs with my children. Yes. So how do you recommend?
Right. And passions recognize that the concerns that people have are real and legitimate. So there's a lot at stake. So for a young Earth creationist perspective, for very thoughtful reasons, if you question the literal 24-hour days of Genesis, you're questioning the foundation of the faith, and everything else collapses. That's a huge concern. That's a very real concern. So I personally believe the evidence does suggest an old Earth, but I'm functionally a creationist. I just kind of accept what the Bible says and work with that and treat it like literal. But I know there's a tension, and I'm very respectful for people of different sides of that tension. For the old Earth creationists, the danger is that if you tell a student something about science and it's not defendable, and a student goes into college and then the professor shows why it's not defendable, then they may lose their faith for what an old Earth creationist would say a needless reason. So the stakes are high. So what I think is the best approach is just say that there's tensions. Like there's tensions in science too. Let me give an example. In science, everyone believes in quantum mechanics. It describes basically the very small, how electrons are around nucleuses and atoms. Everyone believes in general relativity, which deals with the very large. It talks about how light bends around stars, which we can see, how light will bend space, or mass and energy bend space. But scientists know these two theories are absolutely in conflict with each other. Their assumptions are completely different. It seems virtually hopeless to bring them together, yet they're both true. Yet there is a sense that they come together somehow. Some people think it might be string theory, but that's starting to look uncertain. People are starting to question if that'll work. Other people look at things like quantum loop gravity, and there's different ways, but it's an unsolved mystery. So there's always mysteries we don't have. And a really healthy thing to realize with Christianity is it's like a magnifying glass. and I don't know who said this originally, so I'll just take credits. You can quote me on it. It's just totally brilliant. May have been C.S. Lewis, who knows. But if you have like a magnifying glass, the center of what you look at is very, very clear, but the edges, there's fuzziness. In the same way, the center of our faith, the reliability of Scripture, particularly the New Testament, is easy to support with people like Lydia McGrew, wonderful research. The evidence of design is very clear. Resurrection, the historical evidence is overwhelming. That's the center of our faith. The peripheral is more challenging. Like, how exactly do we understand Neanderthals and Homo erectus? How exactly does all this fit together? We may never fully have all the answers, but that's fine. That's always the case, because the center of our faith is solid. It's well defended. There's questions that, we don't know. But I would argue that any other worldview, any other framework, any other philosophy, the center is fuzzy. It's not just the peripheral, but the center stuff is incoherent. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit history. It doesn't fit science. So again, I'd say that it's important for Christians to understand that there's clarity in many issues that are most important, but there's uncertainty, there's confusion, there's mystery. That's very real, and be comfortable with that. And I encourage students to teach them to study for themselves. Look at the best stuff that the young earth creationists have. I appreciate Randy Galuza at ICR. Look at the best stuff the old earth creationists have, people like David Snoke and Hugh Ross. Look at the best stuff that theistic evolutionists have. Look at Biologos. And just study all the arguments, look at the science, figure out what the assumptions are, and pray for how you're going to bring this all together. But be at peace knowing that although, and let me just say this, it's interesting to note that the temptation was the temptation for knowledge over relationship. So the center of our faith is our relationship with God, that knowledge is a gift of God that we should pursue, but knowledge has to be combined with relationship. Because the problem of so many students that lose their faith when they go to college isn't just knowledge, it's relationship. It's a sense of not having a vibrant faith. It's kind of like an exoskeleton. Your parents force them to go to church and everything, but then they don't have all that support. So you want to have children with internal strength, with this endoskeleton that have that relationship with God. And then when they deal with doubt, they can handle it. Like, I was so convinced Christianity wasn't true, but I was like Peter that said, well, where else would we go? Even though this doesn't make sense, I prayed, help me. I was in community and I got the resources to come back to faith. So that's just really important and helpful to deal with this issue. Be gracious. Understand, though, when you cross a line. Like, there are Christians that say, well, because the human body looks so badly designed, we should just reject design and embrace evolution. That is a lie, and that is dangerous, and that is destructive. So if you embrace this materialistic framework, which the evolutionary framework often has, what you find is when that seeps into Christian colleges, they become less and less Christian as time goes on. That's a line you cannot allow to be crossed. But know where the mystery is, know what's essential, and always respond with grace and wisdom. Those are just things.
No, I think that's really great guidance. And so I know this question, this one came in live, but we received at least 15 prior that were basically asking the same thing. So I know it's what a lot of parents are thinking of. And so for those of you who are familiar with Foundation Worldview, you know we've done several podcasts on this before. And what I always recommend is that as we are teaching our kids views on creation, that you do teach the different views that are held within Christianity, that some people hold to young earth framework, teach that, look at the evidence for that. Some people teach the old earth framework, look at why do they do that? What is the evidence that they're claiming for that? That some people teach theistic evolution. This is what they're claiming is the evidence for that. And let them know that it is possible while still holding to the central tenets of Christianity to believe these different things. Then make a case for what you believe and say, this is what I believe and why, and present the evidence for why you believe it and say, so when we're talking about this in this house, we're mostly going to be talking about this, whatever your view is, but then still to explain to them that Christians can hold different views. If you're looking, so Dr. Miller just explained how, the resurrection is central to Christianity. And if you weren't already convinced of that, just go read 1 Corinthians 15 and what Paul says that he delivered, that he received as of first importance. And that's clearly explained in 1 Corinthians 15. But there's a great book. It's really tiny. I actually think I have it on the shelf just back there by Gavin Ortland called Finding the Right Hills to Die On, The Case for Theological Triage. And so what he outlines in that book is like, what does scripture present that is like rock solid? Like these are the primary doctrines of the Christian faith that anyone who's claiming to be a Christian, they really have to hold to these. Or if you don't hold to these, you really can't claim to be a Christian, because this is so clear in scripture and central to theology. And then he goes through what are secondary doctrines, or doctrines of like secondary importance that Christians argue over what the scriptures say, like, for example, infant baptism versus believers' baptism. And then he goes into what he calls tertiary doctrines, where Christians can hold, a plethora of views on things. So that's what I would encourage you on. I know even for myself as a teacher, that I taught fourth grade and then third grade, fourth grade for just a year and third grade for 9 years. And in our science curriculum, like I would always teach a very strong young earth view, which that was what was presented in our science curriculum. And I don't think our science curriculum was bad, but I actually did have 2 students that came back to me when they were, I can't remember if it was high school or college, but they're like, Miss you kind of lied to us. And I was like, what are you talking about? They're like, you presented this as if all Christians have to believe this. And now I've met Christians who believe that Jesus rose from the dead and they have a relationship with him, and they don't hold to this view. And I was like, you know what? I'm sorry. Like that is the view that I hold. And that is the view that our textbook does cover. But you're right that I did present this as if every Bible believing Christian believes this, and that is not the truth. And so then I changed the way, I would still present that view, but I would be honest with my students about not all Christians who are faithfully following Jesus and holding to God's word believe this view about creation. So that would be my encouragement there. And then specifically, I know dinosaurs are a hot topic because little kids love dinosaurs. Like I have my nephews, when they were between the ages of 3 and 7, they were just like obsessed. Everything was dinosaurs. And so with that, that's where you can present the different views that someone who holds to a young earth view would think that dinosaurs were alive at the same time as humans, and that they were made on, that the land ones were made on day 6 of creation. And then present, if someone holds to an old earth view, this is what they would believe. And then, as you're reading through books, you can say, okay, which Christians would agree with this? If it's a book from Answers in Genesis, it would be the young earth creationists. If it's a book that's more secular, it's like, okay, this is something that would align more with the old earth view. But I think that that's a way to do it so that you can stand true to your convictions of where you fall on this and be honest with your kids, but also set your kids up for success in the future, that they're not going to come back and think that you one day lied to them, and that their faith is kind of like this stack of dominoes that just falls flat on its face. So thank you, Dr. Miller, for that. We will get to another question here. How can parents best respectfully interact with educators who are teaching science that is not consistent with a theistic worldview? So good question.
Wow, that's a great question. And the short answer is, I'm not quite sure. That's not my expertise. But what you want to do is you have to understand the stereotypes. So it's really important to understand how they perceive you, what they think you're going to say, what they're going to think you assume. I would go in dialogue. I'd first, ideally, if at all possible, develop the relationship. This isn't always possible, but develop the relationship. Say, hey, I really appreciate a lot of what you're teaching. I think I know you care about students. I know that you have this curriculum you're working on. Let's tell me, what is it you feel you really need to teach? And then say, there is concerns for this and this. Now, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that that's a legitimate concern? So have more of a dialogue about this. And if you know that they're just hardcore Darwinist atheist, and that the more productive thing might be to ask your child to really understand what they're saying, and then being able to critique it, not necessarily in the middle of class, but just really understand and ask thoughtful, respectful questions. Like a friend of mine it's easier actually in college than high school. That can be more challenging. A student was in a psychology class, and she actually was very bright, and she became a Christian. Oh, this is a great story. I have to tell it. She was this atheist as a freshman, and I was about to talk with her why there's design in nature. I don't know if you've ever been in this situation when you're going to get into like a multi-hour protracted conversation. That's what it felt like I was starting to do. In like 2 minutes, she goes, everything you say makes perfect sense. And I'm just like, what? wait, where did that come from? And she became a Christian the next week. Literally, the Holy Spirit like opened her eyes, and she saw truth. She could see the design in nature, and because a lot of it's not just an intellectual battle, but it's a spiritual battle. So
Mm.
just kind of a
Mhm.
funny example. I don't even know why I mentioned it, but that was kind of fun. But again, if you're what this, oh, now I remember the student, what she did was she wrote about how when you look at Romans 1 and Paul talks about sort of this degradation of society, she said that a lot of counsel, a lot of psychological theory follows sort of the same pattern you see in Romans 1. And she got an A on the paper because she did it respectfully. She had a good relationship with the
Mm.
teacher, and she
Mhm.
defended her arguments really, really well. And even though the professor didn't necessarily agree with the arguments, she they felt it was solid arguments. And you have to, again, the emotional intelligence is really important. What is
Mhm.
this person? Is this person dogmatic? Is this person open? Is this person um, really care about truth? You have to really understand who you're dealing with before you know exactly how to
Mhm.
respond to it. A really great
Mhm.
book I read recently was called Escaping Enemy Mode, and it's
Hmm.
by Wilder, and it talks about how the human brain often falls into what's called enemy mode, where our relational circuits shut off, and then we see the person as a danger and a threat.
Hmm.
And there's different versions of that. You can be very calm, very methodical, but in that mode. So you have to
Mhm.
understand when people fall into it and then how to get them out of it. And it's all about
Mhm.
relationship. The more you have a relationship, the more likely you can have a real conversation. So, day
Mhm.
one of your class, you don't necessarily want to say, I think you are a tool of Satan. I don't know what you're doing
Oh
with my kid.
gosh.
That may not, they may not respond well, and they may not sense
Mm.
that's developing the relationship. But if you honor them, if you develop a relationship, then at some point, as they trust you, they respect your child. You can say, "Hey, here's just some of my thoughts. What do you think about this?" I always say, "What do you
Mhm.
think about this?" I ask them, "What do you believe? What are your thoughts about
Mhm.
this?" And then I correct misconceptions. So it's that dialogue approach I think is really helpful.
Mm, mhm. No, I think that's a great recommendation. And I know, so my perspective was opposite. It is mine was like a teacher and how can I develop good relationships
Mhm.
with parents? And so I know that one thing I started to do, I got this idea from my sister-in-law, which was a great idea. Just thinking that I knew that there were behavior situations that would come up in the classroom like on week one. And I was like, I don't want the first phone call to be like, hey, your child is being disrespectful. So my sister-in-law, what she would do is she would set up 10-minute conferences with the parents the first week of school and say, hey, I want you to just come in, tell me everything you want to about your child. Like, I just want to learn about your child. You're the expert on your child. And so those conferences were so helpful for building relationships with parents so that when 2 weeks later I did have to pick up the phone, that parent knew that I was for their child, that I loved their child. And so conversely, if your child is in a secular academic setting, highly recommend that when school starts, and don't just do this for the science teacher, you can do this for all teachers, and not to try to like win anything, but just to let them know that you're grateful for them. Just write a quick note and give them a $10 Starbucks gift card just to let them
Mm.
know, like, we're so
Mm.
thankful that you're investing in our child this year. Because I don't think I mean, maybe there's an exception, but hardly anybody would go into teaching because they're trying to brainwash kids. Like, like they might be doing something that you're considering brainwashing, but most people go into teaching because they genuinely do care about children and they want to make a difference. So go in with that assumption and, build that good relationship, let them know that you're grateful for them. And then like you said, Dr. Miller, go in and ask questions and have a good dialogue there. One final question we're going to go through, and then we're going to call it a day. A bunch of people wrote in earlier with this question, is what recommendations do you have for science curriculum for homeschoolers? Do you have any
Oh,
recommendations?
oh gosh, great
If
question.
not, I can.
Great question. Well, again, you please answer that. In fact, I think what might make the most sense is for you to have a conversation with Daniel, and then that's just something you can talk about. I know that we have some curriculum. If you go to discovery.org,
Mhm.
they have curriculum. I suspect that that's already been that Elizabeth knows about all that. So please
Mhm.
go.
Yes. Well, I was just going to say, when you're thinking about science curriculum, I recommend going with your child's learning style.
Mhm.
That some kids are really, really hands on, and some curriculums are really great at being hands on, like, and some are more video based or some are more textbook based. So go along with what your child's learning style is and then supplement things that are good. So go to the Discovery Institute and bring in documentaries that they have that your kids can watch, or bring in other books or resources. I have not done a thorough study of science curriculum, so I'm not going to be like, this one has this and this one has this. I don't know that. I just know that the one thing that I was impressed with one time when I was doing consulting work in a Christian
Mm.
school, I was observing in a 10th grade biology classroom, and they were using BJU Press science for biology. And in the textbook, it actually outlined what different Christians' views
Mm.
were on certain parts of biology. And I was like, oh, I'm actually really impressed with this, that they're not just saying this and this and this. They're saying, okay, here's the evidence that we find. Here's how different Christians interpret that evidence. So I know I have no idea what BJU Press science is like for the lower grades, but I know that in that 10th grade biology textbook, I was impressed that they were presenting the evidence and then explaining how Christians might interpret that evidence differently. So, but again, my recommendation would be go with your child's learning style, and then supplement with other resources. Well, I'm
One
sorry.
more thing. Also, we have our Roots program, and that's really connecting networks of parents and schools. So
Mm,
we will, over the next several years, be developing more and more curriculum,
mhm.
and will definitely convey that to groups like Elizabeth Group. And then, so just connect with that program if you really want to know what's being developed in the most recent stuff from our end. Thank you.
Great. And remind us, what is the Discovery Institute website?
If you
Remind us
go
of that
to
again.
discovery.org, if you go to
Okay.
discovery.org, we have a section on intelligent design. If you just look
Mhm.
up Roots Discovery Institute, you'll find a Roots program. And then Daniel Reeves is the head of that. Or you can always just go to like cscinfo@discovery.org and just whatever questions you have. But discovery.org is our main site. And then also intelligentdesign.org. That's intelligentdesign.org is more of a resource center also with videos and articles and curricula and things like that.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining us today. Really just appreciate you sharing your wisdom and practical ways parents can implement it. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And to all of you who have tuned in, thank you so much for giving up now an hour and a half of your time as we leave our time together. My prayer for you is the same as always, that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of his son. I'll see you next time.